Well, here we are again. Apologies for the wind, the birds, no apologies for the mosquitoes. Yes, that's an assumption, isn't it? If you're in the Victorian or the Australian countryside, you'll have flies and mosquitoes. That's an assumption. I'm interested in looking today at what was described as a creeping assumption. Now, the commission, or the investigation into the hotel quarantine debacle in Melbourne, has put out an interim report. Well, the councils assisting the commission have summed up, and one of them talked about a creeping assumption. A creeping assumption that it would be the private sector that would deal with the hotel quarantine situation. And that creeping assumption was related to the fact that as far as the public service in Victoria is concerned, it seems that one of its major jobs is to provide work for the private sector. Everybody in the Ministry of Health and the other departments which were connected with this debacle automatically assumed that the private sector would provide security. And that got me thinking about the concept of creeping assumptions, because Australia is based on a number of assumptions which have nothing to do with facts and figures. I know it's the 21st century, and I know it's the new medieval dark ages. I know it's the new dark ages because obviously facts and figures don't mean much in a world that's dominated by belief systems, whether it's political or religious, cultural or social. It's all about belief systems, not facts and figures. But I think it's important that we look at the assumptions behind our society. When I talk about creeping assumptions, I'm not talking about group think, as we saw in the Ministry of Health in Victoria, but I'm talking about nation think, the type of ideas which still are prevalent in Australian society today, which stop us from moving forward and from developing a different culture and a different political system and a different social network which deals with the basic necessities. And this is based on these creeping assumptions. They're more than creeping assumptions, they're assumptions. Now, some assumptions are based on fact. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who lived in conjunction with the natural environment made certain assumptions which they developed over multiple generations. That if a particular flower bloomed, something would follow that flower. And in 99.9% of the situation, we'd have that sequence of events. So this is an assumption which is based on observation, a repeated observation. But the trouble with the assumptions that Australia is based on is they're based on belief systems. Now, the first assumption, which continues to be prevalent in our society, is that indigenous Australians did not provide any resistance to the colonisation process. That they had no form of land ownership. They lived a nomadic lifestyle, and they had nothing to offer Australian society. And when you look at the debate surrounding the need for a treaty or a number of treaties with the different First Nations people, you begin to understand how important that assumption has become. Because if we accept that Australia was colonised, and it was brutally colonised, it means that if we accept the past, it means that we have to do something about it. So as long as we deny that past, we continue to function. We continue to survive. So there's that assumption. The next assumption is that Australians somehow are independent, radical people. We may have seen a little bit of independence and radical thought in the 20s and 30s, and possibly in the 60s. But today, in the 21st century, most Australians are not independent thinkers. A lot of their information doesn't come from analysing what's happened, but from actually accepting what they see and read, whether it's on social media, the government gilded ABC, or the corporate-owned media. And as we saw in Melbourne with the protests against the lockdown, you'll find that the great majority of people, obey the law in this country. So we're not some type of radical society, independent thinkers, and all those things that we take for granted. We're actually won by small groups of people who made major sacrifices in order to ensure that we have many of the basic necessities like a social security network that we have today. Most of these people have been written out of history, and we get the ridiculous assumption in 2020 that the trade unions are some type of enemy of working people. They're the enemy of Australian society. And if it wasn't for people forming trade unions and agitating in the past, then we wouldn't have what we have today. And I think that's important to remember. The next assumption we have, and it is a creeping assumption, which is beginning to dissipate, is the fact that we are all equal before the law. We're told constantly that all Australians are equal before the law. Now, anybody who's been involved in the judicial process knows we are not equal before the law. And if you look at the type of people that find themselves in prison or in remand, you'll find that those that have the resources normally are able to use the system to stay out of jail. And the more money you have, the more disposable income you have, the more likely you will find yourself not serving a prison sentence. And Cardinal Pell is a great example of what happens when you've actually got the resources behind you to challenge a verdict all the way up to the High Court. Now, obviously there are many people in Cardinal Pell's situation who rot in prison who don't have the resources to appeal to the High Court and actually look at the way the trial was conducted. The introduction of legal aid by the much maligned Whitlam government in 1973 was an attempt to give ordinary people the ability to be represented in the justice system. What we've seen over the last 40 years is the whittling away of legal aid to such an extent that it provides minimal protection for most people. So Australians are not the independent-minded radicals we like to think of them as, and Australians are not. They are not equal in front of the law. The next assumption we have, and this is an assumption which is held by a lot of people, is that we have constitutional protections in this country. We are different to China and the Soviet Union. That we have constitutional protections. Now, obviously, anybody can read anything they like in the Constitution. There are people who say there are constitutional protections, but those constitutional protections are not upheld because the High Court somehow is corrupted. The reality is there are no constitutional protections in Australia to protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. And anybody who had the belief that we had those constitutional protections needs to think again. What's happened during the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted how few protections the individual has against the arbitrary exercise of state power in Australia. Now, asylum seekers knew this, refugees know this, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders know this, but we have this fantasy that somehow we have a constitutional process which protects the individual, that gives us freedom of speech, that gives us freedom of assembly, that gives us freedom of association. There is nothing in the Australian Constitution apart from the right to freedom of religion and the right to fair compensation if the Commonwealth forcefully acquires your land, to protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. So if you live in a society where there are no constitutional protections, and let's not forget, the Constitution was written in such a way as to ensure that the state's federated, and then you have a society which is capable of passing the most draconian laws. And we see that over and over again. We saw that during the so-called terrorist fiasco 20 years ago, where over 85 separate pieces of legislation which removed supposedly common law rights were passed, and we see it today with COVID-19. And the next creeping assumption, which again is starting to have holes cut into it, is the assumption that we live in an egalitarian society. It's an assumption that if you work hard, you will get the just rewards. That somehow, if you put in the effort, it doesn't matter where you're born, who your parents are, what type of education you have, you will have the same chance as somebody who's had a private education which has been supported by taxpayers' money, whose parents have networks where the old school tie continues to be important as far as employment opportunities are concerned. There is nothing more ridiculous in this society than the assumption that we live in an egalitarian community. How can 25 million people living on a continent which is resource rich have over 700,000 children living in poverty? Extraordinary. Assumptions that we live in an egalitarian society have formed the backbone of the Australian dream. The ability to work hard, pay your taxes, buy a home, enjoy the good things in life. The reality is this country has changed. We never had that, but it's got worse. And it's got worse because we've had legislation after legislation passed, laws after laws passed in Commonwealth Parliament and the state parliaments, which have made this an exceptionally pleasant country for investors, people with disposable incomes, where taxpayers' money is consistently given to the private sector to bolster their bottom line, while at the same time laws are passed that ensures that if you don't pay your taxes, you're in big trouble. If they don't pay their taxes, they're considered to be heroes and heroines because they've played the system. So we're not equal before the law. We are not an egalitarian society. We have not acknowledged the horrors of colonisation and the need for compensation. No wonder it took over 50 years for the chronic, recurrent childhood sexual abuse which was occurring in institutions around the country to filter to the surface despite thousands of suicides, despite thousands and tens of thousands of destroyed lives. Then there's the assumption that Australia gained its stripes as a nation during World War I. The assumption that somehow the volunteers who fought in World War I were there to protect our democracy and freedoms. Democracy which is very limited and freedoms which are non-existent. The reality is World War I was fought by soldiers, by working people, at either end of a bayonet for the glory of God, King and country. If you go back to the records in World War I, and the anti-conscription campaigns which saved tens of thousands of more Australians being sacrificed on the European killing fields, you will see the word freedom and democracy was never mentioned. It was about God, King and country. Then we have the most important assumption, that you can't change things, that it'll always be like this, that nothing you do will make a difference. And as I've said before, cynicism is the aphrodisiac of those who exercise power. It is their aphrodisiac. And the more cynical individuals and communities become, the more resistant they become to the idea that their actions can actually change society, the easier it is to control people. And last but not least, we have a political system which is laughingly described as a representative democracy. If you look at the people that are elected into Parliament, the great majority are career politicians or career bureaucrats or career trade unionists. These are people who have entered these fields in order to obtain a seat in Parliament. We see our major political parties, both the Liberal National Party and the Labor Party, dominated by factions who employ people as officers in their offices, as chiefs of staff, who then are pre-selected for safe seats. And while we continue to support the myth that Australian democracy is based on the two-party system, and that two-party system equals a Liberal National Party and the Labor Party, we will continue to be a society full of assumption, a society full of cynics, a society that believes that change is not possible. I wouldn't be wasting my time being bitten by mosquitoes at this time of the afternoon if I thought that change wasn't possible. Change is possible. And that change comes from people taking action. And whether it's individual action, or people taking extra parliamentary action, or taking action with a registered political party, change takes effort. The few positive spots that have occurred in this country over the last 40 years as far as change is concerned have come from action. And until we remember that we are the people we've been waiting for. It's not our religious leaders, it's not our political representatives, it's not the people who run the government guild at ABC, it's not the corporate-owned media, it's not social media, it's not the corporate world, it's not green capitalism, it's we who have the potential for change. This is a publication of public interest before corporate interests. As I keep saying, we keep looking for new members who are interested in these ideas. If you are interested and you're not frightened and you're an independent thinker and you want to be part of a social and political and cultural movement that promotes change, then I encourage you to go to pipsy.net, download an application form and join us. If you're not computer literate, you can always write to us at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052, and we'll send you out an application form. But the reality is, as individuals, we can do so much. If we come together, we can do much more. Whether we succeed or not is not the main game. The main game is the fact that we are able to demonstrate that resistance provides results. Thank you for listening. Next week, who knows what we'll talk about.